I don't know what you guys were expecting today. I don't know what you guys thought was going to happen when church started with the music, with the prayer, or the message. But I can tell you right now, I did not talk to any of those people that I just mentioned, even with the gospel moment. And yet every single thing, if you were listening and paying attention, had one theme. It was, God is here. Holy Spirit was moving a lot, and we're going to keep moving. And so I will encourage you right now, if you need a Bible, raise your hand, and we can get a Bible in your hands for you. Someone will do that, and then keep the Bible as a gift. Apart from that, I want you to try to find Hosea as I give you a quick recap. Now, Hosea is in that book of the 12, so it's if you went to the middle, you're probably right around Psalms. Just go to the right a little bit more, and you have to work your way through it. So we're going to be in the book of Hosea. Now, this is the 5th week of our summer series. And as I didn't introduce myself, I'll just tell you my name is Jeff Dawkins. I do serve as one of the elders here. And it is actually a very, very big privilege for me to preach Hosea today, especially in light of the fact that it is Father's Day. And we're going to be talking a lot about the Father's love for us today, as we should every day. In this 5th week, the book of the 12, as we call this summer series, Pastor Doug has taught that this gathering of the books is an idea that God gave his prophets to bring people back for a certain reason and a certain time. In fact, as we go through, week 1 was Obadiah, where God showed his love for his people. And week 2 was Jonah, where God showed his love for all people, not just the ones that were called according to his name. Week 3 was Joel, where God's people's hearts have grown cold. That was the message that Doug focused on. This is the day of the Lord. And last week in Amos, we saw how God's people's hearts have grown cold to other people. Because if you remember last week, we were so full of what we had. We were so excited to be us. Like Doug always says, I like a little bit of me. Doug likes a little bit of Doug. And Jeff likes a little bit of Jeff. And so that's where the people were at. And this is where we walk into at this time right now. Well, today we're going to focus on Hosea to see how God's love pursues the hearts of his people. One of the common themes in the book Hosea is loyal love or sacrificial love. And it's a great story. And as I said that, think back to what I just talked about earlier and the way the service has gone so far. People reaching out on behalf of other people, marriages, families, children. It's wonderful. But I can't say it better than some of these theologians. And I have a quote on the screen from theologian G. Campbell Morgan. He said, "We have in the book Hosea one of the most arresting revelations of the real nature of sin and one of the clearest interpretations of the strength of the divine love. No one can read the story of Hosea without realizing the agony of his heart. Then, lift the human to the level of the infinite and know this, that sin wounds the heart of God." Now, another commentator wrote, "What we see in the prophecy of Hosea are the last few swirls as the kingdom of Israel goes down the drain." This book represents God's gracious efforts to plug the drain. And there's no really better way to start than that idea, not in plugging the drain. It's not where God's going to end with us or with Israel. So the next slide will show you that the books in order that you see on screen bring us to where we're at in this time frame, this Assyrian conquest. So we're in that second row, the Assyrian domination. And Hosea prophesied for about 30 years, from 753 to 722, when Assyria invaded and conquered Israel. Now, Hosea also prophesied during, as we'll see later on another slide, over many of the different kings. You had Jeroboam II, the son of Joash. He was king of Israel. And then there was also Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. That's the time that Hosea was prophesying over. And admittedly, this is a hard book to read. As Rob had indicated when he was looking through Hosea, which is 14 chapters that we're not going to cover verse by verse today. It is a hard book to read. It's very hard. Even for the book of the 12, it's challenging to line up. This is where I started. It was challenging in my mind to line up how absolutely sovereign and absolutely loving God can be in our minds when he uses his messenger Hosea to demonstrate his unquestionable loyal love in the face of open unfaithfulness in marriage and what that looks like. And I thought to myself, well, what God of love would subject his prophets, the people he wants to encourage everyone else, to that kind of abuse? And then God reminded me of the Bible. Joseph, sold into slavery by his brothers, Spent 13 years in prison, God used for good. Isaiah, one of the largest books of the prophets, he was told, hey, I need you to walk with the loincloth and barefoot for 3 years and go ahead and talk to Israel. How about John the Baptist? Lived in the woods, ate some honey, ate some locusts. He was beheaded. How about Paul? Beaten, whipped, stoned, starved, shipwrecked, boiled in oil, and then beheaded. And all of that was to God's glory. But this is God's story and not ours, which is why I make comments like that all the time going, I would never do it that way. And God says, exactly. This is important. That God uses Hosea to warn Israel is important. God's going to use Hosea to warn Israel to repent and to highlight the future restoration of the people of Israel. And that's coming one day through Jesus, and that's the hope we have. That's the assurance. And it brings us to our first talking point question. So in your bulletins, there's a note sheet. On the back of the notes is your talking points. Turn it over. John could not have known this is what we're going to talk about. My first talking question, I want to hear from you. Why does God communicate with his people the way he does? I just recapped some of those wonderful ways he communicated. Why does God choose to communicate with us the way he does? I'm asking. So we learn. Okay, so we learn. So we learn what? Whatever.
It could be, whether it's relationship, financial.
Sure.
It could be all different kinds of things.
There are 66 books in the Bible. God's communicating through all of them for different points, different reasons, and to different people at different times. What else? John said it. God communicates, dare I say this, most effectively when he communicates in hardship. How many of you have seen periods of growth in your life, be it if you're an athlete, if you're a student, if you're going through your Christian walk? How many people have seen the biggest growth in your lives when everything was hunky-dory? And there were rainbows and there were unicorns, and you're like, whoa, yalla, let's go. I can't. How many of you people think that maybe when God tests you as an athlete, when you work out, as a student, when you study, in your Christian walk, as you're presented with opportunities to say, think, and then do the things that you say you believe, how many of you believe that that's a better way to grow? And I think that we all would agree that. And yet we all raise our hands, and yet none of us want to go around that corner where that dark hole is and go, oh, what do you have for me next, God? Do we believe that God is the God of all, but I'm getting ahead of myself? He is the God of everything, and so he chooses to communicate in the way that shows us, hey, here's who you are, but here's who I am. Let's go. God's always shown us about the beauty of his creation, the beauty of his son Jesus. Everything we see in the Old Testament points to the New Testament. And the way I'm going to preach this today is an overview, because in the Hebrew culture, the way that this is written, it's written in this circular way. Doug has talked about this before. So they're going to talk about a point, circle into the main part of that point, and keep moving. Kind of talk about a point, main purpose, and keep moving. Now, I've broken it up into 3 separate areas, and eventually we're going to get there. I will tell you that our training thought of the day that's going to drive everything is going to be centered on this idea. How can redemption be found out of rebellion? How can redemption be found out of rebellion? And I'm going to chunk out a couple different sections, but certainly you'll see all parts of the training truths through the entire book of Hosea. That's how it's written. And we're going to work through the answer of how can redemption be found out of rebellion by looking at Hosea to Gomer, and then the Lord to Israel. And there are 3 training truths I want to bring up. We're going to talk about sin, we're going to talk about judgment, and we're going to talk about restoration. Sin, judgment, and restoration. Now, that doesn't play very well. If anybody's ever seen anyone on YouTube preach, rarely do they start with, I have a great message for you about sin and judgment, and then restoration. That's not usually what happens. People want to avoid talking about the sin part because we don't have to talk about the harshness of God's righteous judgment, and we can just talk about the rainbows and unicorns in heaven. Because that's what sells. You want to fill a room? Oh, just tell everybody that their life is great. You know, everything you did, no, it's totally cool. Just trust in Jesus, bro. And then come on up to the cross, and we're fine. Yeah, but no, I don't want the yeah buts to live in the forest. So that's we're going to walk away from. And this is the problem, because the people of Israel had that idea. They just forgot about stuff. They forgot about the sin, which is our first point. Now, really, the first point, it centers around chapters 1 and 2. It kind of leads through chapters 4 through 7. But for what I'm going to talk about today, chapters 1 through 7, we should get through in the next couple hours. We'll be good. And the idea of sin. So my first point would be, doesn't it seem redundant to you that God, yet again, is going to talk about sin in the lives of his people? Seems redundant to me. I mean, a few weeks ago, I preached up here on Joshua 24. I talked about how Joshua 23, he's giving the people, Joshua, before he was going to die, he's telling everyone, look, here's what's going to happen. You are going to follow these false idols. You're going to follow the gods of your own choosing, your own way, you, instead of him. And it's going to go bad. In fact, in 24, verses 14 through 16, I'll read this. It says, now therefore, fear the Lord, serve him in sincerity and truth. This is Joshua. Put away the gods which your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. He says, if it's disagreeable in your sight to serve the Lord, choose for yourselves today whom you'll serve. Whether the gods which your fathers served, which were beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you're living. But as for me and my house, we serve the Lord. And this is the key. 16 says, the people answered and said, far be it from us that we should forsake the Lord to serve other gods. They got it right. They got it right then, but look what happens in verse 27. Joshua said to all the people, behold, this stone shall be a witness for us. For it's heard all the words of the Lord which he spoke to us. Thus it shall be for a witness against you, so that you do not deny your God. That was the capstone of Joshua's life, was that last part. All this stuff has been written to you so you don't deny your God. And you can see up here in the Old Testament timeline as I walk out of the way, I don't have my laser pointer, but if I did, we would be somewhere on the second row, very left-hand side. The light blue rectangle has a lot of lines going through. Now, if you're looking up at the top, it's the history of everything. History of the Bible and the way God set everything up. It moves on the top row to the Judges era. So right after Joshua's Judges. And this is when God is going to send these different redeemers to try to get people to understand, look, there's this problem. I'm bringing you a judge. The problem solved. We're great. Problem, it's sin, cycle, repeat. It's that whole thing. Now, the next box that I talked about is this kingdom, this monarchy era, where after the Judges, the people said, we want to have a king. Everybody else has a king. We invaded all these lands. These people have kings. Why can't we have a king? You do have a king. That was the biggest problem. Remember, they're denying their God. And so look what happens up here. You can't see it probably, but let me tell you, you had Saul that starts in 1091. He reigns 40 years, and then you have David, 1051. He reigns 40 years, and Solomon reigns 971, and Solomon dies. And up here on the screen, where the black line split, that little red star is 931. That's when Solomon dies, and it's significant because that's when the kingdom splits. The 10 tribes of the north call themselves Israel. The 2 tribes in the south call themselves Judah, and they just go on. They're going to have kings. And there's a whole bunch of mini stories that are wrapped up in this whole discussion. And if you know the history, you know that there were very, very, very few good kings. And there were a lot of very bad kings because people kept running from the true king. But the point about all of this is that the prophets were brought by God to show people different aspects of their sin over and over and over and over again. Or the different people that were going to conquer them. Obadiah was a great example. It was a proclamation against Edom. Here's what's going to happen to you. And so this prophet's age stretches all the way through to the end. And really, Hosea is at 753. 753. This is 650 years after Joshua. So after Joshua says, oh no, I'm going to follow the Lord, what are you going to do? And we follow the Lord. But he says, this is going to go bad for you if you deny the Lord. 650 years worth of denying the Lord, the prophets are here. So we get a little reminder, again, behind the chastening, as my theologian friend G. Campbell Morgan again points out, there is a God of love. And he writes, the supreme thing in every one of the prophecies is that the God with whom these men were intimate was known by them to be a God of tender love, of infinite compassion, angry because he loves, dealing in wrath upon the basis of his love, and proceeding through judgment to the ultimate purpose of his heart. It is the heartbeat of God that throbs in these passages. You see, people, that's everything we need to remember, is that the heartbeat of God throbs in these passages, not just in Hosea, but in your Old Testament and your New Testament. The person of Jesus is not only seen by when you have red letters in the New Testament talking to you. The heartbeat of God is what's giving us all this information, and God is going to really use Hosea through this entire time. Again, I talked about this. Hosea was a prophet to Israel, over 30 years, contemporary of Isaiah. He was addressing this one main point of idolatry, of sin. It was the pulling away. It was the pulling away of recognizing that God is God, and you're not. And you know what they were replacing God with? Baal. They were worshiping a false, sensuous, nature-driven God. They were doing horrible sacrifices. There were children being sacrificed and killed to celebrate this horrible God. There were people that were bringing other people involved in this to perform these massive kid-friendly adult conversations and have these big orgy parties in temples. And if you remember 1 Kings, Elijah was called by God. He just goes out there and says, all right, line up all your prophets. Remember that story? There were about 850 prophets if you're reading how this goes. He calls down the fire of God. God answers to show in that moment, I am the one true God. And you remember, all the people said, you are God, we worship you. Again. We're just going to, rinse, wash, repeat, apparently. And why was Baal the path that people were talking about? Because I had a conversation with someone a couple weeks ago. Well, why? If you know God is God, this is the ultimate question for us. If you're saved, you say this to people. If you know God is God, and you know his way is better, and you believe the Bible is true, then why would you follow this? Well, I could say it in my own life, right? But for the Baals, what was going on is this is an agrarian culture. This is a culture that relied a lot upon farming. And the Baal was this god that created for nature and for rain. And so they figured every time it rained and they had good crops, well, let's give praise to this Baal dude. Because the fathers, pinging on a Father's Day reference, the fathers weren't telling their kids about the Lord the way that Rob and Sue-Ann so faithfully did with their kids. The fathers weren't stepping in. Generations of people had been lost. 650 years had gone by since Joshua. Baal was like, oh, wait, you want it your way like Burger King before there was a Burger King? I know. Let's have lots of fun. Let's eat, drink, and be merry. Read into that how you want. And then just do whatever you want because that's honoring to me. People go, hey, I can worship you, or I can walk this narrow path with these Christians. Why would I ever want to do that? And how fast people turn. And that's where Israel was at. We haven't even gotten into Hosea yet, but let's do that now. Verse 2, chapter 1, reads, when the Lord first spoke through Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, go, take to yourself a wife of harlotry and have children of harlotry, for the land commits flagrant harlotry, forsaking the Lord. That's verse 2. That's the purpose. So Hosea marries Gomer, has 3 children, and again, I knew what I was going to preach. I did not know what they were going to say. We'll talk about these 3 children. Rob adequately pointed out that charis is really the Greek word charis. It's grace. So names have meanings. And what God did, really, in chapter 1, it's through chapter 1 through verse 9, really, is he names the children. You're going to name these kids this. And the names have meaning. And I just want to talk about that for a second. So the first child was born as Jezreel. Jezreel, I talked about Elijah before. Jezreel was the son of Ahab and Jezebel. Should I stop? You should know it's probably not going to go well with, parents of the year right there, okay? He actually killed all his brothers to remain king. When he actually gets overthrown, Joram was wounded. He ends up going back to Jezreel to recover. Jehu was another king who was coming up and saying, we're going to take you. He goes and assassinates this guy. And so Joram is another word for Jezreel. He was thrown down to the dogs, fulfilling the prophecy that Elijah gave. That was Jezreel. And by the way, his name means God scatters. And God was intentional. God's going to talk to his people about scattering. Well, let's just look at Lo-Ruhamah. So the second child, Lo-Ruhamah, means she's not loved. It means she's not loved. So God's going to use this imagery to show that for a moment, I'm going to show you what it's like, Israel, to not be loved. You want to love Baal and everything that Baal has to offer? Go ahead. Because the buffet line closes soon. And you'll see what that's like. Judah stays the focus of God's compassion. So while Hosea is preaching to Israel, there's always a remnant. God is always faithful. His promises are promises, which means we hope expectantly for those promises to come true. And God was always going to preserve a line through Judah. He is now going to show what it's like to not have compassion on Israel. And God still delivers them. He still says, okay, well, I'm going to give you another chance, because we see that even when the Assyrians were preparing to invade, years prior when Hezekiah was king, he prayed, God wipes out 185,000 Assyrians that were sieging Jerusalem at that time. He just wipes them out. One night, wipes them out. We were worried about COVID. I won't even talk about that. God will do what God wants to do for his purposes. It's his story. And so you look back, the name, it means not my people. That name means you're not my people for a time. You're not loved. And Lo Omni is the imagery that God is going to show his special presence. In verse 9, when he says in chapter 1, I am not your God, that stands in opposition to when God tells Moses originally. This is how far back and how intentional God is. God tells Moses, using the same words as the name of the child, I am your God. I am your God. You think God's telling something to the people? He is. And they knew it. They knew it. And through this example, God's long-suffering and patient heart is going to bring justice to the enemies of his own name, while at the same time preserving a remnant. And everything that's here, and everything we talked about today so far, everything is used for God's glory. And that's the defined issue that Hosea has been called to. Hosea has been called to for over 30 years to preach to people your sin of idolatry, your sin of elevating yourself above God is not going to go well for you. Listen up. And then year number 2, listen up. And year number 30, listen up. Because we don't listen very well. I can prove to you it's true because Jesus, in his time in John 2, verses 13 through 17, shows the same intentionality. That was when Jesus burst on the scene and he cleansed the temple. He made a whip and he was whipping people doing business in the Lord's temple. The people would remember the words in Psalm 69:9, zeal for thy house will consume me. God's Son, Jesus is God's Son. He is driving out sin to purify the temple for the people of Israel. And as Christians, we as Christians are the temple. The Holy Spirit in us is purifying our temple. And so God is going to use Hosea in another way to show, look, you need to have your temple inside clear. It's the same battle. So we see that God used Hosea to show Israel again and again and again and again that they have an unmanageable problem of sin and idolatry, and that no matter whom they put on the throne, if it wasn't God, it was going to go bad. Well, let's see now what happens with the God of righteous judgment and what he's going to do about that. Turn your notes over to the second talking point. Here it is. Here's the Apologetics 101 question that I get a lot. Oh, hey, Jeff, if God is love, why does he punish his people instead of just forgiving them? He's God, right? What do you think? So we already learned the way God communicates is through some of these hardships and valuable lessons, but certainly that could be an experience. But now we're talking about God punishing his people instead of just forgiving them. You're God, right? If you're God, why can't you say, the slate's clean, we're good? Why? Oh my goodness, there's love. He loves disciplines. He loves his church. He can't. Here's the biggest issue. God can't and be God. You say, oh, this ought to be good. Unpack this one. You got a couple hours? In summary, what my man Greg points out, God is a just God. And so what does that mean? It means that when God, who is holy and perfect, sees that there is an inflection of sin into his world, he has to deal with that. It's dealt with one way. We get rid of it. And he does that by judging or punishing or excising or cutting out that whole situation. And don't kid yourself. If God didn't punish, if God didn't make people accountable for the sin in their lives, would he be God? Think about that, because people are like, oh no, if you look around and you want to look at YouTube and you want to see how this really plays out, look at some of these cults, and they're cults. Any religion that idolatry is at the forefront, they put anything above Jesus as the Son of God, is a cult. And any time that they say, you know what, it's okay, you don't have to worry about that, just do these things on earth, and then when you die, you can be a god of your own planet. Or I know, just do these things, follow this, and then you can have 78 virgins in some other heaven at some point when you die. I've just given you two different cults. If God doesn't judge sin, then he is not the standard by which all sin can be measured. This is the important part of all of this. Because God is the standard bearer of what it looks like to have good and evil. This is the main issue. The only standard of good, the only standard of morality that comes is because God sets a standard of good and evil. Because he's above that, he is able to say, nope, this is right and this is wrong. If he doesn't say there is wrong, then everything is right, then what's the problem with following Baal? What's the problem with following guys' pornography? What's the problem with guys, as I'm picking on guys on Father's Day, this ought to be a popular message. Guys, what's the problem with going out with your buddies after work? Gals, I got nothing to say. You guys are amazing. You're wonderful. If God doesn't punish sin, he is not God. And so the really long answer to that question ends up being an entire course that we may be teaching again called Foundations about Apologetics. If it comes up, I really encourage you guys to take it. We really get into this stuff. God elevates his name above everything. It's about him and not about us. It may not be the way that we would choose to do it. Too bad. Suck it up, kids. Amen. Let's move on. So we have sin, and then we have our second point, judgment. And so really, if the first 7 chapters or so talk about the sin of Israel, how God is identifying the sin and laying the groundwork for how he's going to deal with it, really, chapters 8 through 10 are going to talk about the judgment. Now, a couple weeks ago, Pastor Doug, I'm going to quote him, he's going to come up on the screen, he said, judgment is one of the ways God uses to shake us awake. This is what he's preaching through Joel. And he's right. This is one of the ways that God will shake us awake. Because God defined who he was and how he was to be worshipped in Exodus. The 10 Commandments, it was Exodus 20. The first commandment, you shall have no other gods before me. Mic drop. We can just move on, Israel. How's that working out? Horribly. So let's keep on hitting that drum. God is faithful and loving and true. He told Moses in Exodus 20:20, it says, Moses said to the people, do not be afraid, for God has come in order to test you, and in order that the fear of him may remain with you, so that you may not sin. And when Israel sinned against God, God had to exact a punishment. He had to stay true to his name because he loves his name. This is all about God and his attributes and his character. And admittedly, somebody had said, I think maybe John had mentioned this, if we were to be righteously judged by God, kids, this is the softball here, what would happen every time we sin? What happened once? We'd be dead. If God was to really, really take judgment out on us, that's the key. We should die for our sins. That was the law. And as you read through Leviticus, we'll talk a little bit about that, but that's the law. But he doesn't. And yet we keep sinning. And we keep not dying. There's probably a reason for that. Let's talk about Hosea specifically. Hosea writes about how Gomer, who was a lustful, unfaithful woman of the world. I think I said that correctly. Okay. He is going to highlight how her ways lead to the marital destruction, that their marriage is destroyed. Their kids don't have a good example in their mom. But really, she's the picture of Israel, who is, in chapter 2, verse 13, following her lovers so that she forgot me. Same theme. We're going to forget God. We're going to follow our own path. Chapters 2 through 10 talked about how God's going to contend with them, even up to 7:22 when Assyria takes them over. But Hosea speaks for God through these chapters relating the sin and the judgment, the promise of future restoration if Israel will abandon their faithfulness. And that's key. And what I had my son read as our key verse, and this is really the key thought for the entire book of Hosea, is in Hosea 4:6. It reads, and it'll be up on the screen. My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Because you've rejected knowledge, I'll also reject you for being my priest. Since you've forgotten the law of your God, I will also forget your children. You see, the people forgot their own covenant that they made to Joshua in verse 27. That was the idolatry. They could only remember what was right in front of them because generation after generation of people had not brought forth God's commandments and promises to follow. And so they were following what they saw. Oof, that isn't convicting. People are going to follow you, whether or not, I don't care who you are, whether you're single or married, whether you're a child or an adult, whether you have kids or don't. Somebody out there is watching what you do. Some other person, not God sees everything. I get it. Some other real person is seeing what you do every single day, and you may not know about it. It's not in my notes, but I received a text message from a father whose son is in the police explorers with my son. And my son made a comment, and for the sake of the longevity of this whole thing, I'll just keep it brief. My son made a comment, there was a discussion, and my son made a comment about me. And the other person's like, well, that's not real. My son said, no, that is real. That's my dad. And everybody just kind of was like, wow. And this dad, who wasn't in the room, I wasn't in the room, says to me, my son told me the story, and he was blown away by how much Luke loves you. And this man said, I just wanted to let you know that sometimes we as dads don't get that kind of feedback, but I just wanted you to know, because if you never heard about that, you should know this is what this young man said. And of course, I'm like, I love you, Luke. But I'm a tough cop, so cops don't cry. Cool. Doug's not a cop. I don't know if you knew that. You could tell. There you go. Let that sit for a second. Chapters 9 through 10 are going to detail how God's judgment is going to interact with the people of Israel. But it's critical to see that this is the critical point. Israel's sin should wipe them off the map a lot, specifically in Hosea. But God is still going to preserve them through his grace, even through punishment. And Israel still kept chasing idols. The book of the 12 we're going to see, it just marvelously shows these different aspects of how Israel and the people around Israel are going to interact with God in his kingdom, with their kingdom. And how does God choose to deal with this? Well, at the end of that map that we saw that was back and forth, and we had the judges and we had the kingdoms, at the end of all that, the end of the Old Testament history, and again, here's my plug, when we do the Old Testament class again, if you haven't done it, my strongest encouragement is go through this class. You will learn to see Jesus in the Bible of the Old Testament in a way you've never have. But at the end of that, we lead into a 400-year period of silence where God really doesn't speak, okay? But then in Galatians 4:4, it's written, but when the fullness of time came, God sent forth his son, born of a woman, born under the law. Because God gave us Jesus. Jesus ends the line of the kings that were there to restore Israel. He is the king. The King of Kings gave us his son through Jesus. We can reconcile everything to see what God did through Jesus for us. And it's all for the fame and glory of his name. In fact, one of the bracelets I wear says, Tetelestai. Tetelestai, which means it is finished. And guess what? The it is finished doesn't mean, it's all done, it's all over. It is finished means it's finished. The work that you had me do, Father, Jesus says, is finished. And that work was to demonstrate that there is one way, there is sin and there is judgment. And you know what? I'm going to pay that judgment on the cross. Don't lose the fact. It is significant that he says, Tetelestai, on the cross. On the cross is when he says it. Not before the cross, not as he is alive and well with the disciples who are freaked out, not before his ascension. He says it on the cross. The symbolism can't be missed. That's what Hosea is going to show us. Hosea shows us a time where on the cross of their sin, God is still going to choose to judge them and restore them. And we can read about that coming restoration and glory in Revelation 19, 7 through 9. I just wanted to put it up here to remind us. We've seen this verse, these series of verses over and over again. I'm just going to read a little bit of this. It says, let us rejoice and be glad and give the glory to him. For the marriage of the Lamb has come, and his bride has made herself ready. It was given her to clothe herself in fine linen, bright and clean, for the fine linen is the righteous acts of the saints. Then he said to me, Write, blessed are those who are invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb. And he said to me, These are true words of God. This stands in stark contrast to the way that Gomer was portrayed. As you read through chapter 2 and even chapter 3, you see that she was not portrayed as wearing white and fine linen and clothed in honor. Because the righteous and true judgment of God against Israel was carried out in many ways. And Hosea tells about the Assyrian conquest. But what's real also is that God's future restoration for his people is seen over and over again, not just in Hosea, but through the whole story. And can I take a minute and tell you that God's restoration is seen through your lives? Again, Sue Ann points out, I know that our relationship with our daughter is where it needs to be now. And I know you said, I hope expectantly. Biblical hope is the assurance of something that you already know God is going to do, and you can't wait for that to happen. That's expectant. That's when parents, you go away on a trip, and you come back and you have young kids, and your kids are doing this whole thing. You think it's because they miss you. They're just wondering what toy you brought them. All right? That's expectantly waiting. When you think about that, that's what God is doing. And he's just using Hosea to show Israel, wait expectantly. Here's what's coming. We have to stay witnesses to the truth. We already have the end of the story. We have the end of the story that these prophets didn't have. Again, I talked about why would God choose to use prophets the way he did? Imagine that. Imagine some of these prophets or people in the Old Testament that never had a chance to understand the person of Jesus is who we're looking for. They trusted God, hoped, and waited expectantly. Remember Hosea 4:6? For lack of knowledge. Well, guess what? If we reject the path of God now, it's not going to be for lack of knowledge. It's going to be for elevation of ourselves. And so every single time, how about this for right down from the mountain? If every single time you sin, I want you to think, as John MacArthur once said, you're walking into the throne room of God. You walk up the steps to the Almighty, and you kneel down in front of God and commit your sin in front of him. When you believe that your position in light of God allows you to walk the steps in the throne room and do that,